You know what it is. That's right. It's time to talk money with your money nerd and financial coach. Now, tighten those purse strings and open those ears. It's the Money Talk with Tiff podcast.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Money Talk with Tiff podcast. So today I have Derek Mobley on the line. He is a native of the Piedmont Triad, which is where I live. After graduating from Chapel Hill, he moved to Guilford County in 2009 for graduate school at the Bryan School at UNCG. Go Spartans! Derek is passionate about education and economic development. For example, he enjoys participating in local organizations such as the Greensboro JCs, which is where we met, Future Fund, Wyndham Championship, and Junior Achievement. And I'm so happy to have Derek on because he is a pivotal person in the community and he really knows his stuff. So thank you so much, Derek, for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I'm going to jump right in because what you came to talk about is something that you're very passionate about and a lot of people don't really know, including myself. And so I was like, this will be a perfect opportunity because not only does this topic, not many people know about it or talk about it, but it impacts all of our lives on a daily basis. And what that is how the finance side of the local government works and how it impacts our lives. So let's just start with how does the finance of a city work or a county work?
Sure. Yeah. So, I'll preface it with, we have 50 states. So, sometimes different states can do it slightly differently. So I'll be coming from the perspective of North Carolina, and I may talk a little bit about, some of the variations. But one of the things to know, immediately is kind of the state, like North Carolina or Alabama, wherever, is really kind of the foundation of our national government, because we started out as 13 colonies. So it's just, one of those things to get your perspective. If you go overseas or something, kind of the national government is sort of the head, but really, in the United States, it's the states that are kind of the foundation. And the reason I say that is because that ties into your local government. So, like the cities and the counties in North Carolina, for example, they're all created by our state legislature. So that's the first thing to keep in mind is that, the city government and the county government, basically everything that they can do and all their borders are all defined by your state legislature. So that's why it's really important, to understand, who your state legislators are and what they're working on, because at any time they can come in and change this. Mm. And so, that's to say they, give the local government the authority to tax you. So that's why, it's important to understand that. So the city and local governments, the way they're primarily financed is number one, property taxes. So, that's the taxes that you pay on your house. They also charge you different fees for the services they provide. So, like when you get your water bill, usually if you live in the city, that water bill is coming from the city. And then they can also do things like sales taxes. So those are the main things: property taxes, usage fees, and occasionally sales taxes. And again, all those things that they can charge you are set by the state legislature.
Interesting. So let me just break it down for my audience. So we have the federal government, which is kind of like its own kind of thing, but it's really the states that really affect us on a daily basis. So we have the state government, and then the state kind of dictates what the cities and counties do.
Right. Exactly.
Gotcha. So with that being said, if we want change, do we look at our local governments or do we look at our state government?
So I guess it kind of depends on, where you want the change to happen. So, again, it's like your local government has the ability to property tax you, for example. So if you want property taxes to change, one way that you can do that is by, coming and speaking to your local elected officials or getting involved, with candidates, because they can raise or lower your property taxes. They have the authority to do that. But, then again, if you're not satisfied with what they're doing, it is, possible to go to kind of the state legislative level, and you could have a broader, generally the states, they don't like to get involved in like your particular county, but they can pass a law, that says, hey, property taxes can't be applied to this set, of goods or something like that. Like if you don't want to tax bread or something like that, that would be something the state legislator might get involved in. So, it depends on how far you get, but I would definitely say you start at the local level.
Gotcha. Okay. So we know how how the government gets money. So now, okay. So, and we know that affects us by, we have to pay our taxes and things like that. But also, how does that affect us, as far as how they spend money?
Right. Again, one of the other things that makes the state and local governments different from the national government is, they usually have to have a balanced budget. So, like the national government can run a deficit and, we know that's happening, right now. But where we live in Guilford County, every year, they have to propose a budget and every dime, basically has to be accounted for. And, they can issue bonds if they want to, but, if they don't, then, something has to get cut out. So, whenever they're providing you services, if the revenue isn't sufficient to cover those services, you have to know that those services are going to end up getting cut, so like property taxes, they fund your schools, they can fund different, social programs. And so if property tax revenue is going down, they can't just borrow money to fill the gap. So you have to know some of those services are going away. The other thing I think that's actually pretty good about local government, compared to the national government, is it seems like it's more transparent, at least to me. Again, I'm speaking from Guilford County and Greensboro, where we live. They publish their budgets, every year. And, it's not like 50,000 pages. It's usually a couple hundred pages. So, again, it's not easy, but you'll get to see, this is where all the money is that came in. And these are all of the programs that you spent it on. So I feel like it's a lot easier for you to know what's going on and try to formulate an opinion than it is, at the state or the national level. So I'm not sure if that answered your question exactly, but.
No, and I agree with that, because I'm one of those people that opens up every single piece of mail that comes in the house. And so when I open up my, let's say water bill, for instance, it tells you how much your charges are. And then it also says if they're going to do an increase and why they're going to do an increase. They give a lot of information here locally. And it's just a matter of tapping into that information. So that way you can be aware of what changes are going to happen, if any, right?
Right, exactly.
Now, one thing that you did mention that I kind of want to backtrack to, just so we can have more of an understanding. You said that the city or the county or whoever can issue bonds. What does that mean exactly for the audience? So,
the city and the county and, municipal people, they can issue, what's called a bond, which is basically, it's a loan. It's very similar to if you were to buy a house, right? Like you buy a house, you could put a certain amount of money down and then you get a mortgage from a bank. And that mortgage is, basically contingent on your income. So, the city and county governments can do the same thing, is they basically, and it has to come to the voters. That's the other thing, is they can't just, most of the time, they can't just decide they're going to borrow money. They have to do a referendum for you to vote on it. And then, basically they're authorized to borrow this certain amount of money. And then what they pledge against it is the property taxes, the fees. So they're basically, when they borrow that money, they're pledging the future money that they're going to collect from you towards paying that off. And, the biggest example is, for schools, is if you want to build a new school or you want to reconstruct a bunch of different schools, that can be very expensive. And a lot of times you can't just pay for that out of the ongoing revenue, from the state. So they'll issue a bond and then they'll pay it off over time. So that's kind of how that works.
So just to kind of bring it back home, it's when we had to vote on that school bond thing that was at the bottom of the ballot. And it was
right.
You check yes or no. And they said this will go towards, getting rid of some schools, but updating others, and just a whole school overhaul thing. And,
right.
A lot of times, just as a regular voter, usually we just bypass that. We're just what, I don't know, whatever,
Yeah.
But this stuff is really important because it may affect, maybe your taxes or other things, right?
Right. And I'll say the interesting thing to know about that, again, this is getting a little close, to, Greensboro or Guilford County, but it's applicable overall, is they had that, the bond piece on there, and there was another piece on there for a sales tax increase. And basically they were supposed to be tied together, because you're going to issue that bond. So that means there's going to be, more tax money that they're going to need to pay for. And, their kind of proposal was to pay for it by increasing a sales tax, not increasing property taxes. And so the bond passed, but the sales tax did not. So, so what, people don't like to have their taxes go up, but what that means, right. This is one of those, assuming nothing else happens, right, is, over time, the county is going to have to pay the money back for those bonds to fix those schools. And that's going to come out of the tax revenue. So that means there's going to be less tax revenue available for other services. So, by voting for the bond and voting against the sales tax increase, that puts the county in the position of, unless something else changes, they may have to decide to cut other services in the future to pay for the school reconstruction. So, number one, that's why you should always vote. And then number two, definitely, you understand what the impact is of how you vote, right? If you vote for more spending and not higher taxes, you're voting for cutting services somewhere else. So just, understand that.
Right. And that's important, though, because a lot of times, when we go in to vote, we're just like, OK, usually people vote straight down the line, whatever it is that they agree with. And, when it gets to like those little things like, oh, no, I don't want to get taxes taken out. But
right.
We get more schools, that type of thing. So but it's important to realize, and, I just want to drive this point home to my audience. It's like everything is connected. Everything is connected in some way. So even if, like Derek was saying, we didn't vote for the sales tax to get approved, well, guess what? Now something else is probably going to have to, diminish a little bit so that way they can make sure that they can cover, because it has to balance. It's not like the federal government. So that is an excellent point. I'm so glad you brought that up. So hopefully that inspires some people to do more research when it comes
right.
time to vote, to really understand like what the implications are of A, maybe not voting, or B, voting and you're not quite sure why you're voting a certain way. So I think thank you for sharing that, because that is so super important. So so let me back up a little bit, because, I love that you're a government expert, because we've never talked about this on the show. And so we have the government and we're talking about state, local government, they can get money from us to fund their programs by taxes. And that looks like property tax, sales tax, whatever other taxes they have. And then bonds. Are there any other ways that they can fund the budget?
I mean, one of the other main ways is grants. So that is one thing, especially at the county level. And again, the grants can come from the state or the national government, where if you want to do a special type of program, like the national government, the state government, all the time, they will fund to make that happen. Like, again, I know here in Guilford County, I work with the Transportation Advisory Board, and a lot of their funding, basically one of their main things is providing service to, like senior citizens who are in poverty. So, you think about it, they need to get to the doctor's office. They may not have a car, may not be able to drive. So, how do they get there? So there is a program that the county operates to try to help those people get transportation, but it requires money, right? And so a lot of that money comes from from state and federal grants. And again, you tie that back, those grants at the state and federal level, again, are coming from tax revenue or future tax revenue, but that's not necessarily local. It could be, the taxes come from all over the country or all over the state. So that's the third, I'd say, biggest way.
And so I'm glad you brought that up, because here's another question and kind of connection, if there's one. So like, for instance, with Medicaid and Medicare and food stamps and all of these different programs that are put into place by state, they are still funded by federal somewhat, or is it all internally state?
So again, it's kind of a mix. They'll usually get federal funding and then a mix of state funding. And then again, it's really, and I think this one's more at the county level usually than, again, just speaking from the city of Greensboro, they don't seem to have as much involvement in this, but usually the county kind of administers those programs. So, the money comes in, but it usually, funnels into the county, and then the county kind of manages that program. So that's why, again, your county government can be really important because they can help determine eligibility for the programs. And then, they're kind of in charge of actually providing the service. So, that's, so if you don't think the service is being provided well, that's more of a county level issue. If you don't think there's enough funding for it, that's state usually and federal level issue. So.
Okay. And so here's another good question, which people have, asked me about. So how does, so we're in the city of Greensboro, right? But, for instance, services like that, we have to go to Guilford County Department of Social Services, or, we have to pay property taxes to Guilford County. And so how does the city and county, how is that relationship when it comes to the financial side? So
the best way to describe that usually, I've heard people say it's kind of like a bowl of spaghetti is, again, we're getting a little specific for the city of Greensboro, but the city of Greensboro, will usually take care of, roads inside the city of Greensboro. They have a city of Greensboro, police department, and the city of Greensboro has a property tax, right? So, if you live in the city of Greensboro, like I do, you have a section of your property tax that goes to Guilford County, and then you have an additional one that goes to the city of Greensboro for the services that the city provides, like the trash and the sewage and, the other things. And so, it's like I said, it can get really complicated because a road can start in Guilford County and then go into the city of Greensboro. And if you want to fix that road, Greensboro and county have to work together. And so there's usually a lot of funding, that can go back and forth. So, again, Greensboro history, some cities have their own school systems, right? So Greensboro used to have its own school system. So they would have their own superintendent and their own education funding. Here in Guilford County, we're consolidated. So the county manages all of the schools, but it just goes to show you sometimes there can be duplications of the service just within the county and within the city. So, So I guess that's my way of saying it can get very complicated.
It's when you ask lawyers, it's complicated. Maybe, it's you never get full because there's so many variables that it could be. And so I guess the overall gist is that, you may have to pay city and county, but the city pays for city services. So your city police department, the trash, that type of stuff. And then the county stuff pays for the county services. So that's more overarching things like Medicaid, Medicare, food stamps, things like that. So thank you for that explanation, because I think that will help people also when they start looking at their bills and things like that, it gives them more understanding on how this all works together, right?
Right. Because a good example there, like you said, since the county controls our school systems, if you have an issue with what's going on in your schools, and, like in Greensboro, you go to your city council and you say, the schools are terrible, we need to do something about it. The city would say, okay, well, go talk to your county commissioner, right? So
you're telling us this why?
Right, exactly.
So, and that's a good point. So if there are any issues that you see in your local community, it's important to know how it's being funded so you know who to actually go to.
Right. That's a perfect way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because just like you were just saying, I'm in the city of Greensboro. So of course I would have automatically thought, well, the city controls these schools, so I need to go to the city. Well, no, you're actually complaining to the wrong person. It needs to be the county, because that's who actually controls it here. So that's why this information is so important, because, it all starts with education and knowledge. You have to know this stuff first, so that way you can start enacting change if that's your prerogative. You can start enacting change. You can start looking at the ballots a little differently. You can start doing a little more research, looking at your bills a little differently. I personally feel like the city of Greensboro does an excellent job with keeping us educated. It's just a lot of times their education goes in the trash because it's in there, with our bill and stuff. And so like every month with our water bill, they give us like a whole newsletter for the city. And so it tells you like what they're doing, what's going on, what type of programs are available, grant opportunities, maybe. Like there's so much information in that one pager that I feel like, if we just read it a little more, get more in tune with our community, pretty much, we can kind of use it to our advantage and use it to help other people and things like that. So I thank you for this education, because it all starts with this, right? So speaking of history, right? So let's just talk about, so when we talk about state government, local government, things like that, what part of economics is that? Like, where does that all fall in? Like, is it macro, micro? What is macro, micro? That type of thing.
Yeah, sure. So, I would say it's probably both. A lot of times people think of the government in terms of macro. Especially when you get to the national level. So you've got the Fed and you've got, so like monetary policy would be one piece, and then fiscal policy is the other piece. So that's very much macroeconomics, which is, what happens when interest rates go up or go down, what happens when the government, runs a deficit or doesn't. So that's one level, I think, where the government is macro. But there's also a lot of, I think, what's called microeconomics, which is more at the individual level. So it's one of the things I'll actually, UNCG, when I was at the Bryan School, microeconomics was the focus of my program. And what they spend a lot of time on is, they'll do, modeling of things like WIC, which is the Women's, Infants, and Children. It's a program. So they'll try to model how effective these programs are at reaching the people they're supposed to reach, and what does it do, to change their behaviors one way or the other. So, again, if you really want to go, like down the rabbit hole, there's probably millions of pages of economic analysis of people saying, we need more funding for WIC, or we need less funding for WIC, or, WIC does this, or food stamps do this. And that's really kind of the microeconomic level. So you'll see it everywhere.
Gotcha. So just to recap for my audience, so macro is looking at more of the overarching, policy. So like the federal government and how interest rates move, how much money is being printed, all that stuff. And then micro is more on a personal level, like, your local government, your local, how does that affect you as an everyday person type thing? And I think having even a basic understanding of both will allow you to kind of use it and pivot to your advantage and to your community's advantage. But you have to know how it all works to begin with. And I know a lot of people, especially my listeners, because, I've had a lot of different conversations about, economics and things like that. And a lot of people just don't understand how the government works, which I completely get. I was horrible with economics when I was in school. Like those were the toughest classes for me, because it's like sometimes it doesn't quite make sense. Like, how do you just print money? Like what is it based on? That type of thing. But then once you start getting an understanding of how it affects your everyday life, then it's like, okay, well, I know that right now in the economic cycle, we're at a peak. So what's coming next? It's probably going to be a recession. So what can I do to prepare for that on a personal level, with my household? And so like, I just had this conversation with my husband yesterday, actually. I said, yeah, it's about to hit the fan really, really soon. And so we need to start positioning ourselves, in a way to where when it does hit the fan, we aren't as affected. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, yeah, that's a good, I think, approach to it. Cause, again, it's really hard, it's really hard to predict recessions. If anybody could do that really well, they'd be rich. But I mean, we do know that as the economy gets, stronger, as it, it gets easier for you to borrow money. And at some point that all turns around. So if you're stuck in a position where you've borrowed a lot of money when it was easy to borrow money, and then suddenly everybody's not giving out money anymore, that's how you get in trouble, so like you said, that's why, you need to, be conservative, I think, with debt in general is my, just my tidbit of advice. And that's why, is because when times are good, people will hand out credit cards, and you can rack up $20,000 of debt, and then suddenly you want to roll it over and no one's giving you another credit card.
Right. And even another example that can bring it home for the audience is if you look at the 2008-2009 crisis, right? Everybody was getting houses, and people that probably shouldn't have been approved were getting approved, subprime mortgages, all types of things. And when it hit the fan, really those people weren't supposed to have the houses to begin with because they couldn't afford it. So then when it came a time where people started losing their jobs because businesses are not making enough to support the salaries and, everything starts domino affecting, it's like, okay, now I have this house that I really couldn't afford to begin with, but a bank told me yes, so I thought that I could. And then now I'm having to go through bankruptcies and foreclosures and things like that. And so I kind of see the same thing happening now a little bit. And the point that I made on my social media not too long ago was that, all the government help that we've been receiving for COVID, yes, it's been good, it's been great, for the moment. But what that does on an economic level is it pumps money into the system. And so that way it ups the demand of all goods. And so then what happens with that? Inflation increases. And so now, if you go look at the gas station, like I was just looking yesterday when we were over there on Gate City, and I was like $3 and I think it was like $3.50, $3.60 a gallon for regular. I'm like, in North Carolina, that's like usually unheard of. Like we kind of maxed out at $3. So it's just like now things cost way more than what they look at the housing market, right? And so it's like things are costing way more. So when that government help and everything stops, then what? Because now people are accustomed to living this lifestyle that they've set up for themselves. And so now once that happened, bam, we have an income cliff and then we come crashing down. And so it's being aware of how everything plays together. Like everything that the government does, everything that we do, it all affects something else. And so you kind of have to, and part of that is being exposed to this type of knowledge. That's why I wanted to have you on, is because you have to know how these things all work together. So that way you can be aware of what's really happening with your finances, right? Because sometimes it's outside forces that are affecting these things. And you're just like, all you see is, oh my gosh, like I don't have any money. But then you're not realizing, okay, well, it's because inflation's super high. It's the highest that it's been in 20, 30 years. And so that's why you don't have any money, is because you're spending way more.
Your spending's gone up. Yep.
And it's might not be no fault of you. I mean, just look at gas. Like you're just trying to cover your basic necessities, but everything is at a higher cost. I had some people talking about meat the other day. They were like, oh my gosh, meat in the grocery store is ridiculous. I'm like, everything is ridiculous at this point. But it all goes back to economics and having this knowledge to where you can understand, okay, the law of supply and demand,
Right.
If money's being pumped in, demand goes up. Supply, it starts getting lower and lower. And so it has to go back to an equilibrium. And usually how that happens is prices raise. So that way less and less people can afford it. And so that way we can come back here and the economy can kind of balance out. But it's going to be a hard balance this time.
Yeah.
So I know I went on a tangent, but
no, that's fine.
But I do want to get a little bit more into like the history of this, right? So the history of macro and micro, like how, I guess my question is, how did this all get set up? Like, how did this become a thing? Like, how are we in where we are right now?
Like from the economic Well, yeah. So economic history wise, and this is kind of, I will say it's sort of a very Western type, perspective. But, there was a book, it actually came out in like 1776, the year of the American Revolution, called The Wealth of Nations. And it's like this thick. And Adam Smith is the author. He was like a Scottish, English, Scottish, sort of social commentator. And, it's both macro kind of and micro. They didn't call it macro and micro then, but, there was a big preoccupation, kind of from the 1700s to, the early 1800s of why are some nations prosperous and others aren't? And, kind of the idea then, there was a thing called mercantilism, which was based off of gold. So they thought, hey, if you have a lot of gold, then you must be a really wealthy nation. So, they basically had kind of political scientists whose job was to figure out how do you get more gold for your country, right? And Adam Smith he's interesting because he was the first person who kind of realized that it's not really the gold. It's really just the amount of stuff that you can make. Because again, this goes way back, but like Spain, when Spain discovered, not really discovered because people were already there, but, when Spain first made it over to the New World, they got a lot of gold. And to go back all the way to Tiffany's point, all this gold came over to Spain. And what ended up happening is everything in Spain got really expensive because they had all this money, right? But not more stuff. So it really wasn't all that good for Spain. And so, Adam Smith, again, started the idea of, how do we produce more and become more prosperous. And then there's kind of a line, from there of people studying Adam Smith. And then they realize, there's stuff that happens at the individual level. And then there are big things, like how do you finance your budget effectively? What are the roles, of banks? And that, is kind of like the classical era of economics. And what came out of that, is the sort of the idea that the government should be hands off. They thought, so the idea is, you still see this a lot, that economics is an equilibrium system. So the government should just stay out of it. When supply goes down, prices go up. And, that's kind of the idea. And then there was a thing, the Great Depression in 1929. And people argue, that what that showed is, no, the economy isn't always a self-regulating system because we had massive unemployment and, people were a lot of misery for almost a decade, right? So they argued, like, how can you say the economy is a quickly adjusting system when you're looking at this, right? So there was a much more interventionist sort of macro policy that came out of that. And that kind of takes you to where we are today, where, with computers and people trying to be scientific about, hey, the government does have some role to play in the economy, but we're never quite sure exactly how much. Because again, right now we're seeing inflation. In the 1970s, we had a similar thing where it looked like the government way overstimulated the economy and it caused massive inflation. And we had to raise interest rates to try and balance things out, which pushed the economy into a recession, and nobody's happy when there's a recession. So, again, it's kind of this, sort of like cat and mouse game now of how much should we intervene versus how much shouldn't we? And COVID's the latest example of that, right? Like, again, kind of to Tiffany's point, we intervened way more with COVID than we did in 2008 or 2009. And so what are going to be the repercussions of that? We don't know, right? We're about to find out over the next few years. So.
Yes. And I mean, if you think back, just like we were saying, like with 2008, 2009, the government had to start stepping in and bailing out these companies that kind of got themselves in a mess to try to save the economy, without it completely collapsing. Right. Which, like, if you just think about that, just on that level, it's like, wow, like we can kind of be detrimental to ourselves. And the government, they do have some tools to kind of step in and try to level things out. But like in this situation currently, inflation is the highest and interest rates are the lowest. And so usually how the government steps in and tries to save the economy is by, either lowering or raising interest rates. And if they raise it, then it's going to, like, usually they raise it, and correct me if I'm wrong, because like I said, economics is not my strong suit. If they raise it, it will kind of send everything further downhill. And usually they try to lower it to, kind of recover, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that's the Fed. The Fed will raise the rates to try to slow things down or, lower them to try to pump things up
Right. And see where we are right now, there's really nowhere to go because, we can't lower them any further because they're already at the lowest. And
right.
When I was at the Bryan School in one of my econ classes, she's a phenomenal economist, but she had already and this was back in 2017, 2018, she was already talking about this. She's like, we can't go any lower with interest rates because then if anything was to happen, there's no way that we can recover. And now look at us. Mm-hmm. And she was saying it back then because interest rates were low. And so it's like, wow, once you start really thinking about how all of these things play a role in everything, it's kind of mind blowing, but then also it's a little empowering because then you can kind of see for yourself, okay, if I know that interest rates are at its lowest and I know that inflation is at its highest and the government, there's really, I mean, unless they come up with some new economic policy, there's really no way for them to really help us recover, then you can kind of start for your own personal house, kind of getting things in order, maybe lowering debt, like Derek said. So that way, when things do come crashing down, you don't have all this overhead that you have to pay. You can just focus on, surviving at that point. And so anyway, all of that to say, all of this stuff is super important to kind of at least get a basis of understanding. And that's why Derek is on today, because he is the man. He's the man for all of this. Now, I do want to hit on one more thing because I'm so excited about this. I know that you're running for local office. So if you can just explain that a little bit for my listeners that are here in our community, what position are you running for and why, pretty much?
Sure. Well, I appreciate you bringing that up. So I'm planning to run for county commissioner in Guilford County in what's called the District 3. So again, we touch on local government. Sometimes just like in the House, they'll kind of draw your area into different districts. And so people who live in that area, can elect a certain person. So those are called the districts. The other thing you have is called at large, which is where it's kind of a general, it's almost like electing the president, right? It's everybody gets a vote in that certain area. So, I plan to run for county commissioner. And, one of the reasons, for that is, again, I think people should be involved in local government. We touched a little bit on the schools. So, we, as Tiffany mentioned, we had a bond referendum back in, I think it was 2020 that passed. Obviously, the financing for it didn't get passed. And then, based off of the need that, to me, it seems to be, it maybe was not quite enough. So that's, I want to get involved in that. Another thing kind of in our county, I always say our state has done pretty well economically. And certain regions, the Triangle and the Triad, or not the Triad, I'll say the Triangle and our Charlotte metro region have done really well over the past decade. Our county has kind of been, plateauing a little bit. Incomes, median incomes have actually gone down a little bit. And, why that's bad, obviously, the story of the U.S. over the past, couple hundred years is people's incomes going up. They have more purchasing power overall. So if we're not having that, that means people are less well off. If you've got inflation, it makes it even worse. It can drive down housing prices, which lowers your property tax revenue. So it's kind of, I feel like our state is on a good trajectory. For some reason, our county isn't. And, I think it's number one, we're not really investing in our education. And then, number two, I don't really think we kind of have an economic development strategy. And that's kind of, my area. So that's why, I encourage people to get involved in local politics. And, this is my way, trying to practice what I preach a little bit. And the other thing I'll just mention, it's almost a total aside, but it related to our earlier conversation is most counties have a school board. So when we talked about getting involved with your school, the school board is usually another elected entity. And they kind of work between the county and the state on, funding, for teachers. They hire the superintendent of the schools. So that's another area, again, because to me, public education is one of the things you should be most concerned about at the local level, because it really affects, those are the people that you're turning out into your community, for jobs and everything. So if you have a poor public education system, you're not on a good long-term trajectory. So that's why I just wanted to throw that in there for anybody who's really interested in local education. Your county is one place to go, but the school board is another important thing to look at.
Awesome. And I also want to throw out there, because I hear a lot of people like, oh, teachers don't get paid enough and, things like that. And so if that's a concern of yours, join the school board, join the county commission, because these are the people that, they're the liaison with the state to get us to where we need to be. So thank you so much for bringing that up. This is phenomenal information, very educational, and hopefully my audience got, if nothing else, I hope that my audience got the gist that everything is connected, how you vote is important, how the economy works is important. So that way you can apply it in your everyday life and have more of an understanding of what is going on. So Derek, with all of that being said, because you dropped so many gems, how can people get in contact with you if they were interested in reaching out or learning more about you?
Sure. So I guess I'm on LinkedIn. So if you type my name, Derek Mobley, I'm probably one of the first ones that'll come up. Also, for campaign wise, my website is electmobley.com. So, it's all just one thing, electmobley.com. If you go there, it's got my email address and, the number, which will, forward to my phone. So and I'm on Facebook, so I should be I'm pretty easy to find. And, I try to be transparent. So feel free to reach out.
Yes, absolutely. And I will tell you all from experience. Well, first of all, I have all of those links in the show notes. So don't worry if you didn't catch that. Check out the show notes. You can click, and get with Derek, whatever your heart desires. But I will tell you all from experience, Derek is very, very, very passionate about the community. We've served on boards together. We've done different things around the community together. So I can vouch for that personally. He is an awesome person, and he's very forthcoming with any knowledge that he has. Like, I know when I was serving on a board here locally that he had just, fell off of, I was like, Derek, I need help with this. I need this. Can you help me with this? And he was always so nice. And he was always so helpful. And so I highly recommend, if you have any questions about how the local government works, or any questions about, county commissioner position, if you just wanted more education on what that even means or what that entails, please reach out to Derek, because he is a phenomenal person to have as a knowledge base. Like we used to joke and say, like, he is the encyclopedia of everything, because he knows so much, but he's so forthcoming with that knowledge. So thank you so much, Derek, for being on the show today. And I wish you well in your, your running, your candidacy, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you for listening, joining, and being a part of the Money Talk with Tiff podcast this week. You can check Tiff out every Thursday for a new Money Talk podcast. But if you just can't wait until next week, you can listen to previous podcast episodes at moneytalkwitht.com, or follow Tiff on all social media platforms at Money Talk with T. Until next time, spend wise by spending less than you make. A word to the money wise is always sufficient.